All right, we are live, ladies and gentlemen. For a number of years now, we've heard about big tech censorship and the role government may have played. Thanks to investigations like the Twitter files, we've gotten some insight into coercive pressure put upon social media platforms to remove certain content. Well, now the Supreme Court is hearing a case on this very matter. At what point is the government overstepping the protections of the First Amendment in an effort to curb misinformation? Can we count on the Supreme Court to safeguard free speech? How important are the results of this case? And, what else do we have to say about the Supreme Court? We're going to be talking about all this and more on episode 441 of the In the Tank podcast. Oh yeah, welcome to the In the Tank podcast. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendall. Joining me today, I've got Jim Lakely, VP of the Heartland Institute. How are you doing today, good sir?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm actually kind of grumpy today because of your choice of topics, especially our opening banter, which isn't on the title card, but it's probably going to take up a good bit of the podcast. You made me watch and clip several things from MSNBC. I made you come into my office, though, to suffer with me to show it to you and where we were clipping it. And we both got very triggered. And now I have much more respect for Chris Talgo, also on this podcast, because he volunteers to watch that stuff on his own time. So
yeah, we've got a fatal
for that.
We have a fatal dose of MSNBC loaded in the chamber for you. Also joining us, we have Chris Talgo. He's editorial director here at the Heartland Institute. How are you doing today, good sir?
I'm doing good. MSNBC is kind of like, one of my favorite channels. It's really great. They have great news coverage. I mean, they're really honest. They're almost as good as CNN, Donnie, So, I mean, I don't know what your guys' problem with MSNBC is. I mean, they're like really, really great TV. Like, what's
all right, enough. Before we get into any of this, audio-only listeners that are probably catching the show on a Friday or later, why don't you leave a review for us on iTunes? It would be greatly appreciated. Or you could join us a day earlier where we are live streaming this on Facebook and YouTube and X and Rumble, and you could join in the conversation. Throw your comments and questions in the chat. Maybe we'll show your comment on the screen. Maybe we'll address your questions on the fly. Super chat functionality is enabled if you want to support the show that way, and guarantee that your comment or question is read on air. Or you can help us out just by hitting the like button, sharing this content, subscribing if you haven't already, or just leaving a comment under the video. All helps break through those big tech algorithms that prevent content like this from being shown to more people. But yes, there is a very important topic that we need to start off with. I know we're going to start off, dedicate most of the show to this First Amendment case that is being heard by the Supreme Court of the United States. But before we get into that, guys, I mean, I think Trump just went too far this lately. At one of his campaign rallies, he's over there threatening to, have the streets run with the blood of his enemies. He's talking about basically genocide over there, calling for bloodbaths and everything. I mean, guys, can we really allow Donald Trump to be the nominee? I mean, I haven't really read into the story. I'm just looking at the headlines and some of the MSNBC coverage. But, man, I mean, this guy's got to be stopped. He's a madman. Am I right, Jim?
Yeah, if you watch MSNBC, and we are going to inflict it upon the audience as well, since we had to suffer through it, you and me. It's a window, because I don't watch MSNBC, and you and I and us three and all of the listeners and viewers of this podcast are well informed, because we are not consistently misinformed and propagandized by a media that sees as its sole purpose is to propagandize for the regime and for the Democratic Party. And they literally have no standards at all about truth or objectivity. And we'll show that here because, as yes, we all had heard, from last week that Donald Trump, or was it this week? I don't even remember, because these sorts of hysterias tend to go on and on and on, and you kind of lose track of time. But he had said that, well, let's just say the headlines in all of the major media and on all of your cable networks, with the exception of Fox and then some of the smaller ones like Newsmax TV and others, was that the claim that Trump said that if he loses the election, it's going to be a bloodbath for America. And by that, they say that he meant that he would inflict his standing army of MAGAs, apparently armed to the hilt, to take to the streets and cause death and destruction, and the streets will be blood will be flowing through the streets like rainwater. Is like nothing you've ever seen. This is un-American. He must be stopped. When you see these headlines, normal people like us, people who are informed, not misinformed and malinformed, but actually know what's going on, is to see that and just think it's crazy. Who would believe that? The trouble is that the propaganda is so constant that a good chunk of America actually does believe this. And the irony, of course, is that the opposite, as usual when we're dealing with the media, the opposite is the truth of what they are telling you. Because everybody knows that if Trump wins the election in November, that's when they will be, if he wins, that's when there's going to be violence in the streets. Everybody knows this. We knew this in 2020 when there was actually a standing army funded by left-wing organizations and ultimately George Soros. This has been widely reported. We're ready to take to the streets and basically burn down American cities if Trump won the election. And when that didn't happen, they all just melted away and went away. This was in that infamous Time magazine article talking about fortifying the election. So the opposite of what our corrupt corporate media is telling you about the 2024 election is the actual truth. And sometimes I wonder if our precious really has any chance of surviving when we have a media this corrupt and this lying. It makes the media makes Pravda actually live up to its name, which is truth in Russian, compared to what we have going on now.
Yeah, this is just it's an absolutely absurd story. I think a lot of people could look at this and just kind of write it off as par for the course, considering, all of the way that the media has treated Trump and taken some of his quotes out of context over the last, 8 to 10 years, something like that. But I feel like this has got to be the worst, most egregious example of that entire period of time. And that is an extremely high bar. And I think, I mean, we'll show the clips and everything, but I think everyone kind of knows by now, because it's been in the news for a little bit, his comment of the bloodbath and whatever, and how they're taking it out of context in the media. But I'm telling you, people can bring up the good people on both sides, or the all Mexicans are rapists stuff, whatever. That's just the media taking these these things completely out of context and just blowing them up to massive proportions. But I swear, this has got to be the worst one yet. And when I first heard of the story and decided that we were going to talk about this on the podcast, I had only seen some of the headlines, a whole bunch of different headlines, just using that quote. Even Drudge Report. I don't know, Jim, where Drudge Report stands in the whole, just spectrum of political thought now, but even they had it, just with the quote marks around it, bloodbath. He calls for a bloodbath or something like that. And I didn't realize that it's beyond the headlines. I thought it was just clickbait. Once you actually click on the article, they'll put it in the context, and it's just for the sake of headlines that they want you to click on. But when I actually started pulling up some of these clips on MSNBC, I was blown away by the way that they're running with this. Chris, I do want to play some of these clips, but your initial thoughts before we see how the other side is responding to this.
My initial thought is that this shows how desperate and how terrified they are that Donald Trump is going to win the election in 2024. And I think that they are resorting to anything possible, pulling out all the stops to try to, tarnish him. But I don't think it's going to matter. You gotta understand, and you gotta remember that the vast majority of MSNBC viewers already have a passionate hatred of Donald Trump. So they're not really convincing anyone. I think they're just trying to play into the base. And this also is just really like how I think intensely scared the producers and the hosts and the employees at MSNBC are with the state of the race right now. The polls are showing that, you know, Donald Trump is going to crush Joe Biden in 2024, you know, barring something crazy unforeseen, you know, happening between now and then. So the only bloodbath I see coming is at the polls in 2024, and it's going to be Joe Biden who is going to be, you know, bleeding, you know, his votes from 2020.
Yeah, I think we should probably play some of these clips, just for anyone that didn't see it and just kind of assumes that the media is taking it out of context. Well, let's actually show the tape. So we've got one of these clips is the actual in context Trump using the term bloodbath. Let's see how he presents it, and then we'll show how the media responded to it. So let's go ahead and play the Trump clip.
Mexico has taken, over a period of 30 years, 34% of the automobile manufacturing business in our country. Think of it, went to Mexico. China now is building a couple of massive plants where they're going to build the cars in Mexico and they think that they're going to sell those cars into the United States with no tax at the border. Let me tell you something to China. If you're listening, President Xi, and you and I are friends, but he understands the way I deal, those big monster car manufacturing plants that you're building in Mexico right now, and you think you're going to get that, you're going to not hire Americans, and you're going to sell the cars to us. Now, we're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. If I get elected, now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole... That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it. But they're not going to sell those cars. They're building massive factories. A friend of mine...
So that's in context. He's talking about the auto industry. He's talking about how they're going to be undercut by the Chinese electric vehicles being built in plants in Mexico and then driven over the border and sold to avoid certain tariffs. We talked about all of this either last week or 2 weeks ago. So to hear Donald Trump talking about it was fantastic. But the fact that this clip that was taken out of context is sandwiched very clearly in between comments about the auto industry. In fact, he says it's going to be a bloodbath, for the country. And then he almost like stops short. And I feel like if he were to continue that thought, he would have said for the auto industry. But yeah, so now the media takes that clip, not even that clip, a little part of that clip, and makes it seem like he's calling for some sort of genocide in the United States. And you think I'm being hyperbolic, but I'm not. Jim, anything you want to say before we play some of these MSNBC clips?
Yeah, I mean, Trump does tend to, have his thought interrupted, or he interrupts his train of thought or ad libs. Obviously, he was reading a speech. That's the thing that people kind of forget, and you'll see that in the clips we're going to play in a minute. But the word bloodbath, I would imagine, it's pretty certain the word bloodbath was actually in his speech that he was reading off a teleprompter. And so the idea that he would write that, meaning that he's going to be sicking his MAGA army armed to the hilt again to slaughter any non-MAGA person out there, it's absurd. And he was obviously talking about an economic bloodbath because, in fact, just this week, or yesterday, the Biden administration quadrupled down on its desire to make only electric vehicles, the only vehicles that America can make and that we can buy in about 6-7 years. And so that's what he's talking about. It's obvious that that's what he was talking about. And all the people that are taking him out of context and trying to, frankly, scare people, panic people into thinking that we're going to have some kind of like Haiti situation on our hands in the United States is beyond irresponsible.
Good old Donald Barbecue Trump. Let's go ahead and play some of these MSNBC clips just to show you just how crazy this all is. Jim, go ahead. We've got I think we got two, but go ahead and play. Let's just play them back to back. Go ahead.
All right.
Let's play this bloodbath comment from that rally in Ohio yesterday.
We're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. If I get elected, now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole, that's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it. But they're not going to sell those cars.
So, Governor Whitman, you know, he loves to mush a lot of stuff in what he says, and then his campaign says, oh, he was only joking, or oh, it was taken out of context. He wasn't talking about violence in the country. I call BS on that. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. That is BS on that. He was definitely sending a call to his supporters to have a reprise of January 6th, but even worse, because he is calling, when he says bloodbath, that means more of the weapons that we saw on January 6th. And it's appalling to have an ex-president. Former is for someone who was defeated in the polls. Ex is for someone who was, former is for someone who just left. Ex is for someone who was defeated. The ex-president, an ex-president of the United States, to say that and follow it up with that'll be the end of elections as we know them. He's being pretty clear about what he wants to do should he get back in power. And I think it would be shame on us if we ignore this. We saw it happened back in the 1930s when a fellow called Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, and he said exactly what he was going to do in that. I don't think Donald Trump could write a book, but he's giving it to us verbally.
I did not pause it for 1 second. So I will be completely honest. When it came to watching these MSNBC clips, after 30 seconds, I'm like, all right, that's enough for me. I can't do it. I didn't make it to her comparing this to Hitler. I did not.
You missed that.
I did not expect that. All right, go ahead.
They do that all the time. They do it on the hour.
All right, keep playing.
Well,
keep
okay,
playing.
but yeah, first of all, what do you mean with all the weapons on January 6th? Nobody had weapons. Nobody had weapons. None of the rioters had weapons. They did not come there armed. So the lies that people get from our corrupt legacy media is just unbelievable. Putting the Hitler thing aside, just crazy. All right, a little bit more.
Well, Jonathan, number one, you have to understand that Donald Trump speaks what he feels. He never holds anything back. Bloodbath is what he wants. He said the same thing about January 6th. But the only lie was that he said he was going to walk them to the Capitol. He didn't. You had thousands upon thousands of people who did not go through those magnetometers. The magnetometers on the ellipse when he was having that rally, right? But they knew, and the Secret Service knew, in those bags, they had things that would not have made it across there. You're already hearing a lot of his supporters say this. Trust and believe this election for Donald Trump is by any means necessary. Take what he says seriously. And not only that, you cannot change the narrative on this. Bloodbath, that's what he wanted the last time. If he would have had that, if one congressperson or senator was killed, we would not be here today. We would be under a dictatorship. And think about this. Mike Pence can pray and say, I forgive him, but he's not supporting him. And one of the main reasons why for president he's not supporting him, they erected a noose for him. If they would have caught Mike Pence that day, trust and believe, he would have been swinging on the mall in Washington.
There you have it, folks. Really unbelievable stuff. I can't believe this. This seems like satire. This is an actual mainstream cable news station that is having a panel of everyone nodding in agreement that he is just not even dog whistling, straight up calling for the murder of all of his political opponents. They're sitting there nodding yep, this is where we're at now as a country. This is unbelievable, Chris. You're telling me that this is a daily occurrence? This isn't just an off day?
No. This is every single day on MSNBC. MSNBC, I think, is the worst offender. I think CNN is not as bad. But yeah, I watch, Morning Joe while I'm just kind of getting ready in the morning and stuff, just to see how they're trying to frame everything, that is going on. This is what they do. This is how they quote unquote present the news.
Yeah. Okay. So we got.
But then Donnie, you wonder why their audience is a couple 100,000 people. Gee, well, maybe that's why.
Oh, we got off Don Lemon over here, but I think we've got another host saying very similar stuff. Let's play the other MSNBC clip, and then we'll wrap this up, Jim.
Donald Trump intensifying his violent rhetoric. Surprise, seemingly threatening a, quote, bloodbath if he doesn't win in 2024, while dehumanizing immigrants and embracing the terrorists who tried to topple the government on January 6th. And that was just one weekend. The first full weekend since the general election matchup became official. And it all happened in the course of a single campaign rally. Here's Trump in Ohio.
We're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars if I get elected. Now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it. But they're not going to sell those cars.
Trump's bloodbath comment comes amid a campaign in which he's vowed to be a, quote, dictator to target rivals and to seek, quote, retribution, which is why his critics are skeptical of the campaign's cleanup effort, claiming Trump was just trying to say, quote, Biden's policies would create an economic bloodbath for the auto industry and auto workers. But no one believes that.
Nobody believes that. Nobody could possibly believe that.
Nobody
in a
believes
speech
that.
where he's talking about the automakers and how it's going to be terrible for the American auto industry if this happens, and he uses that term. No one believes that's what he's actually talking about. Maybe he should take some advice from the April Ryan in the past clip where he says, listen to what he says, not just conjure up all of this make-believe or what you want him to think in some weird fan fiction of reality. This is so absurd that I cannot get over this, guys. I'm sorry. Like, if he were to go up there and say, this is going to be bad for our industry, you know, a lot of people are going to be losing their shirts, would they be like throwing a hissy fit talking about how he's predicting some type of t-shirt theft ring is gonna spontaneously appear if he's not elected? Like, they are that out of their mind when it comes to this. Bloodbath, if you look it up, if they took 5 seconds to just Google it, Cambridge Dictionary has a second definition of it where they talk about how it's like in economic terms. I have it right here. A very bad situation in which a lot of harm or damage is caused. And then the examples of that is the government seemed determined to continue in the face of electoral bloodbath. Another example, we know there will be a bloodbath of job cuts in January and February. Is Cambridge Dictionary talking about how a bunch of people are going to be murdered in the streets because of job losses in January and February? I doubt it. This is so crazy to me that, like, they have to know, right? They have to know that they're just spewing lies here, right?
Of course, I guarantee you that they know. But Donnie, you know, one of the things that I think is different between the MSNBCs and the Foxes of the world is that Fox actually respect their viewers. So they have really good guests on. They usually present both sides of the argument. They have a really good, vigorous, you know, healthy debate. MSNBC, on the other hand, and CNN is very similar in this respect. They talk down to their viewers. And they think that their viewers are very stupid and that they can be manipulated with, you know, just ridiculous arguments like they're making here. So I also think it's another reason why so many Americans are tuning out MSNBC, because it's not what it was 15, 20 years ago. I remember MSNBC used to have both sides of the debate. They, you know, obviously they leaned left, but, you know, they still incorporated in a robust, debate on the issues. They don't do that anymore. They don't do that at all. And that's why it's so boring to watch them, because all they do is lecture their viewers. And it's just like this, like, incessant, like, echo chamber. Fox doesn't do that. That's why Fox just, crushes them in the ratings every single hour of every single day of every single week.
Jim, I'm very curious. I asked you this question yesterday evening before we left for the day, and you said you were going to ponder on it.
Oh.
Ponder away, or hopefully you're done pondering. But I asked you whether or not you think that these people on MSNBC and the clips that we watched actually believe this, or they know that they're lying and they're saying it anyways in the greater good attempt at just harming Donald Trump. Do they actually believe it? Are they that delusional, or are they doing this as an ends justify the means approach?
I have to believe the latter has got to be the truth. I mean, April Ryan was the second one on that first MSNBC show that we showed. She's covered the White House for a long time. She was covering the White House when I was covering the White House in the second term of George W. Bush. So she's been a reporter, if you want to call her that, but she's been covering the White House for a very long time. And she stated to the audience of MSNBC that Donald Trump's intention was to lead an armed revolution at the Capitol by him, in his person. That's what he wanted to do. What she did not say is what he actually said. Again, this goes round and round. And I guess if Trump is reelected, we're going to have a lot of triggering events, you and me, Donnie, as we watch the media have to deal with a second Trump administration. But he had said in his speech, he encouraged his supporters to go down to the Capitol. That is true. He said, and to protest peacefully and patriotically. Those were the words that came out of his mouth, and that most people that watch MSNBC and CNN probably have no idea that he had ever said that. And they actually do believe what April Ryan lied and said, which was that Donald Trump, she said this on cable television. She wants the viewers of MSNBC to think that Donald Trump's plan was to lead a march up to the Capitol with an armed army to overthrow the government. And if they can get their hands on him, hang Mike Pence.
Right.
So do I believe that April Ryan actually believes that? I cannot believe that she actually believes that. The best answer, Donnie, is that they don't believe it and that they're using this rhetoric to panic half the country. And because Trump derangement syndrome is a real thing. And it just makes people's minds, it breaks people's brains. It breaks people's brains. April Ryan was a left-wing reporter for I think she was a national correspondent for like black urban radio stations, for the news that are on a lot of those black stations around the country. She was always from the left then, but she wasn't completely crazy like this. I mean, her brain has been broken. Everyone in Hollywood, their brains are broken. Everybody at the New York Times and Washington Post who could see that. Look at the headline we have on here. New York Times. Trump says some migrants are not people. By the way, he was talking about the MS-13 gang members, not all immigrants, but they don't care. They don't care. New York Times is going to lie to you. So this is purposeful. And he predicts a bloodbath if he loses. Trump once again doubled down on a doomsday vision of the United States. I mean, this is active lying. This is terrible. And actually the destruction, the economic destruction, the economic bloodbath for the media, I love seeing it because no industry deserves it more.
Yeah, it's one thing if it's MSNBC preaching to the choir, but this is, and we just showed MSNBC clips, but this is like a media-wide thing. And just like anecdotally, my wife comes back from visiting her mom with the boys, and she's like, "Oh, you won't believe it. My mom brought up the bloodbath thing, and I had to explain to her how much out of context it was, and she was surprised to hear it." I'm just like, unbelievable. Like, this is getting down to everybody. It's not like she's sitting there watching MSNBC. She probably just caught it on some nightly news update on, ABC or something like that.
Johnny, here's why
it's unbelievable.
Here's why.
Final word on this, Chris,
yeah.
and we're going to move on.
Yeah. Because the New York Times, the Washington Post, they set the media agenda. The New York Times is the quote unquote the paper of record. So when they print lies like this, that allows the MSNBCs, the CNNs, the ABCs, the NBCs, and the CBSs to run with it. I think that what has become very clearly apparent in 2024 is that the mainstream media is an arm of the Democratic Party. They will do everything they can to protect Democrats and everything they can to make Republicans look as terrible as possible. You just have to accept that. That is baked into the cake. Yes, it's getting worse and worse and worse. I remember in the 2010s and stuff like that, we thought, oh man, the media is so biased. It is nowhere close to what it is now. The modern mainstream media is an arm of the Democrat Party. Simple as that.
Yeah, pretty crazy.
Which kind of goes into our next.
I was going to say, even with all this fake news and misinformation in these headlines, I don't see any conservatives saying that they want these stories banned from being shared on social media. I think that shows little bit of a difference between your average left and right. But let's get into it. Let's get into the big tech censorship, this First Amendment case that's in front of the Supreme Court as we speak. So big tech censorship, it's been an issue that we followed on this podcast for years. It started off as basically an assortment of stories and anecdotal evidence from mostly conservatives suggesting that they're being unfairly treated by social media companies like Facebook or Twitter, YouTube. As time went on, though, this pattern was increasingly impossible to ignore. We also occasionally got some insider information from certain employees from some of these companies admitting that they would manipulate the trending topics to push liberal bias in one way or another. However, we could never really get very clear insight into how these social media companies were operating because obviously they're behind closed doors. This is until something remarkable happened. In late 2022, Elon Musk, after criticizing companies for their lack of free speech principles, purchased Twitter. And not only did he purchase Twitter, but he vowed to unearth as much information as possible on their content suppression and outright censorship. So Elon opened the doors to a handful of journalists and authors. He allowed them access to emails, Slack conversation, and other internal communications. This group rooted around for a while until they eventually released the Twitter files. So the Twitter files revealed basically confirmation of essentially every accusation made by conservatives for the years leading up to the release of the Twitter files, whether it be shadow banning certain prominent conservatives, censoring, throttling other people, you name it, they were doing it. However, the Twitter files also expose a pretty deep relationship between higher up Twitter employees and different government actors, most notably the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. One of the released Twitter files suggested that the relationship between Twitter and the FBI was so tight, it was almost as if Twitter was an FBI subsidiary. This relationship is important to know in order to understand the whole Hunter Biden laptop story that was crushed by social media. Since the release of the Twitter files, there has been more stories that have surfaced. Higher-ups at Facebook had scheduled monthly meetings with the Department of Homeland Security. We know that the Department of Homeland Security, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the State Department worked as part of the Election Integrity Partnership to fight misinformation on social media platforms. All of these are topics that we covered extensively on the podcast. You'd have to go back and look at old episodes to find this, but we covered it extensively just to show you how intertwined the government was in the big tech censorship. So some of these questions as to how much the government could do to influence social media in terms of their content moderation have been making their way through the courts. And one of those cases has made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Chris, can you lay out kind of some of the basics, perhaps, of what this Supreme Court case is all about?
You hit the major points here. It really is about social media companies doing the bidding of the government. And you named a couple of the agencies that were caught literally red-handed telling the social media companies, hey, take down that post, or or don't promote this post, or whatever it is that they did. It was a lot of it was based on so-called misinformation and disinformation about the pandemic. So anything related to the vaccines, social distancing, anything related to masking, all that was, off limits. And the original case, which was Missouri v. Biden, the judge ruled that the government was guilty of using their powers to tell these social media companies, hey, erase this, or don't promote this. And, it wasn't just the social media companies. I know this is not nearly as egregious, but it's still, I think, worth mentioning. And Donnie, you and I talked about a little bit about this. A White House senior staffer even emailed Amazon telling them anti-vax books you can't promote. Put that on the quote unquote do not promote list. So if they're going to the nation's largest bookseller, Amazon, and saying, we don't want you to even promote in your search results any book that might be counter to the narrative that we want to put forward, that the vaccines are the greatest thing since sliced bread, which is completely not true. They're not even vaccines. I know that we can't say that, but they aren't. And the government was using its power to tell these social media companies what to do. And unfortunately, in most cases, the social media companies cooperated. And now we have the smoking gun evidence. But Donnie, like you mentioned earlier, I think this is very important. We've known that this has been happening for several years.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the shadow banning was a real thing, whether it was Donald Trump Jr. or a whole bunch of GOP politicians or other people associated with the Trump movement campaign, whatever you want to call it. So we know that the algorithm suppresses information that the social media companies does not want to get to the top of the search result list or whatever it is. And I mean, I know we're going to talk about this much more, but the reason why this is so scary to me is because the modern technology can allow this to happen behind closed doors versus in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s, when the government actually had to go to these places, surround the newspaper printing presses or whatever, take it over at gunpoint and say, no, you're just not allowed to do this. So this new advent of social media allows them to do it digitally, which is super scary because they can do it without us even knowing about it, had it not been for Elon Musk putting his money where his mouth is and buying Twitter and exposing all of this.
Right. Yeah, Jim, I mean, it's kind of interesting because a lot of people, I think latest polling shows that like a majority of people, especially young people, get their news through social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or TikTok now. And it's not that like these social media companies, generally speaking, are creating news. It's just the avenue in which news is propagated to all of the different people, right? And we know just from our work that social media is a very important way of disseminating news and content to your audience. So it's almost like become a choke point of information. And if the government is coming in there and deciding, telling the conduit in which all of this news is being disseminated to people, that they can or cannot spread certain news, or they have to de-amplify it or whatever they do. That is a incredibly powerful thing that the government would have power to do. So I feel like this case, it's probably a little flying under the radar because of how important it really is. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, yeah, and let's be clear. I mean, and it was this way. If Twitter under the old regime feels like being nothing but a left-wing propaganda social media site, it has every right to do that of its own volition. The problem, and what is an obvious and clear violation of the First Amendment, is when government cooperates or instructs, or in this case, threatens these social media companies with ruinous government regulation and investigations if it doesn't do what the government wants it to do. And in this case, it's suppressing the truth about things like COVID and Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and vaccines and all the stuff that I can just keep going down the list. This video has probably already been almost demonetized and it would be flagged soon anyway. But it's
how great our elections are.
Yeah. Right. I mean, but it's one thing if Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, it's not exactly a social media site, but there's such a social aspect to it that it operates in much the same way. If they make those choices, then they can make those choices. They're actually free to do that. But it's when the government coerces and you cooperate with the government, and the government is saying this speech cannot be emanated, it cannot be said because we decree it so. And we're going to play the clip here in a second. Ketanji Brown Jackson infamously didn't know what a woman was, or couldn't answer that in her confirmation hearing. And she apparently doesn't know what the First Amendment is either, because she thinks, well, we'll let her speak for herself here. You ready for that, Donnie?
Yeah, sure.
Jim, can I ask you one quick question before you do that? What about the role of there is, with the the shield that the social media companies have, they're supposed to not put content down on either side unless it's pornographic or unless it's like calling for violence. So how does they get around that with this?
I
Are
don't
you
know.
talking about like Section 230?
Yes, there's Section 230 liability shield.
Yeah.
Oh,
So yeah, I
Because
can talk on
based
this.
on the Section 230, it's supposed to be a wide open platform, and as long as you're not doing something that's pornographic, like child porn or something like that, it's supposed to be an open platform. That way, that they can't get sued by either side. So how can they justify saying we're going to take down all of this stuff, but we're going to allow all the other stuff to stay up? And we want to have our cake and eat it too with our Section 230 liability shield. I mean, it's like how can that exist?
I mean, the Section 230 thing is an important concept when we're talking about any of this big tech censorship, because as Jim kind of mentioned, the idea that Twitter can kind of regulate, they can moderate the content all they want. And yeah, because they're a free market, private institution, whatever, they should be able to do that. However, in a lot of conservative opinion, that if they do that, then they're foregoing the idea that they're a platform and operating like a publisher.
Right, exactly. Because then they're an editor.
Exactly. So if they do that, again, a lot of conservatives argue that they should lose their Section 230 privileges and be open to potential liability lawsuits when it comes to people defaming them or, different libel stuff, that they're posting that they're not moderating out because they're acting like a publisher. This is kind of a separate topic from all of that. This is just simply the government coming in and arguably coercively telling these companies what they can and cannot allow on their platform. So it's kind of two separate things, but I do think it's important to always kind of keep the Section 230 debate in mind when we're talking about this.
But just put a bow on this. But couldn't they say, hey, based on Section 230, we have an obligation to keep this stuff up? Couldn't they do that?
I would think so. However, okay, so you brought up the Amazon thing. So like you said, a government official goes to Amazon and says, you got to take down some of these books, right? These anti-vax books or something like that. And if I read that article correctly, Amazon initially said no. But then internal dialogue in Amazon was like, it's probably not great to say no. Like they're kind of leaning on us pretty hard. Maybe we should do it. And this kind of comes to like the role of government when it comes to all of these platforms, whether it's Amazon or social media and whatever, where it's like the person that's making the request isn't just a peer. It's someone that holds the fate of your entire industry and company in their regulatory hands. Right. So are you in a position to say, oh, you know what? No, thanks. Like I would love for one of these platforms to say like, yeah, you know what? We're an open platform. So no, like buzz off government. But I don't think any of them have the backbone to actually.
But do you notice that it's always one-sided? Because it's never when there's like, the Trump administration saying, hey, we want you to take off all the stuff that makes us look bad. That never happens. It's always one-sided, which is to me shows that it's blatantly unfair. And it once again shows that social media platforms by and large are also an arm of the Democrat Party, which means that they control social media and the mainstream media.
Oh, yeah. No doubt. Yeah, I think the crux of this entire argument for this case has to do with, how coercive is the government actually being when it comes to this? Are they like are they mandating that the companies do this, or are they just substantially encouraging it? Are they non-coercively urging these companies to do these things?
FBI paid Twitter millions of dollars to take down the stuff that they wanted to take them down. So paying them millions of dollars, does that constitute government interference? I mean,
I guess our Supreme Court will determine that. But as Jim was setting up, it seems like some of the questions, at least for some of the justices of the Supreme Court, are even more foundational than what I just laid out. Is it coercion or is it just non-coercively urging? So yeah, let's play the clip of I think she's the newest Supreme Court justice, right? Yeah. Ketanji Brown Jackson. Let's see what she has to say about First Amendment protections. Go ahead.
Yeah, and just to set it up very quickly, I mean, she's trying to come up with a scenario, and these are the kind of intellectual exchanges that happen, hypothetical exchanges that happen in the Supreme Court arguing all the time. but she's trying to create a situation in which the government would have a very compelling interest in basically violating the First Amendment. Here we go.
Justice Jackson?
So my biggest concern is that your view has the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways in the most important time periods. I mean, what would you have the government do? I've heard you say a couple times that the government can post its own speech, but in my hypothetical, kids, this is not safe, don't do it, is not going to get it done. And so I guess some might say that the government actually has a duty to take steps to protect the citizens of this country, and you seem to be suggesting that that duty cannot manifest itself in the government encouraging or even pressuring platforms to take down harmful information. So can you help me? Because I'm really worried about that, because you've got the First Amendment operating in an environment of threatening circumstances from the government's perspective, and you're saying that the government can't interact with the source of those problems.
That's right, Jim. So in or Chris, if you want to take your first swing at it.
Yeah, just jump in real quick here.
Go ahead.
What frustrates me so much about this is that she's talking about it in the context of the pandemic.
Sure.
And at the immediate outset of the pandemic, I remember there were a couple high-profile senators saying, "Hey, this thing could have originated from the Wuhan lab, which was located, right next to where the virus supposedly, came from." And they were just told, "You're a crazy conspiracy theorist," blah 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 blah. So and then throughout the pandemic, we were told time and time again, ivermectin, don't use that, or this, don't use that, or this, blah blah blah. The government was actually wrong so many times throughout the pandemic on so many issues. But she has the audacity to say the government's always right. We should just have the power to have the ability to say this is right, this is wrong. I think that is so symbolic of where she's coming from. That the government is all knowing, it's omnipotent. It's like it can never be wrong. Mm-hmm. We're coming from such a different place. We're coming from, hey, the government is just made up of fallible people. They do things wrong all the time. And that's why a free exchange of ideas is the best way to get to the truth. I don't think she really wants to get to the truth. I think she wants the government to have the final say over everything. That to me is a totalitarian, dictatorship where we don't have freedom of speech. But to me, based on, I've read a lot of the other things she was saying during this, that's the kind of society that she wants to have. Mm-hmm. It's so mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, I mean, Jim, so what do you think? I mean, this, like Chris said, this is all under kind of the justification of pandemic. That's the context of all of this. During a pandemic, in order to safeguard public health, like you're hamstringing the government from protecting people's health by telling them that they can't encourage or pressure, is her words, social media companies into suppressing certain content. I mean, what's your response to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the part that, is just kind of gobsmacking. It's like she says, my biggest concern is that your view has the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways. Exactly. That is what the First Amendment is for. The First Amendment is not there to hamstring us and our rights. In fact, all of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution is a document outlining negative rights. In other words, what the government cannot do to you. Most other progressive societies, including the Soviet Union, by the way, had lengthy constitutions full of all the rights that you have. And they were all positive rights. Like you have a right to housing, you have a right to afford, health care, you have a right to this and that and the other thing. But the United States Constitution, especially the First Amendment, is very clear and very simple. It is designed to hamstring the government from suppressing your speech. And I didn't grab the clip, Donnie, but one of your favorite clips is from one of your favorite former foreign prime ministers, that being Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, who had that infamous clip where she looked at the camera during a press conference during COVID and said, if you hear any information out there that is not from us, from the government, you shouldn't believe it. The only truthful information you will get is from us.
Right.
paraphrasing, but that's almost exactly what she had said. That is not that is not the kind of characteristic that's not characteristic of a free country. That is characteristic of a totalitarian instinct and nature among people in power, and such people should be as far away from power as possible, because those are the kind of people that turn countries into actual dictatorships. Not talking, a little bit here on the campaign trail about stuff like we seem to have in this country, this panic over a supposed dictatorship from Trump that's coming up. He didn't take any dictatorial actions. He didn't, for instance, just decide to, I'm just going to give everybody, waive all of their student loans, or I'm just going to declare the internal combustion engine illegal from now on, and we're just going to make all our vehicles electric from now on. Those are that's kind of dictatory, isn't it? But that's not the kind of stuff Trump ever did or even talks about doing.
It's also
the idea that a Supreme Court justice is there talking about how, well, the government has an interest here in speaking. She's kind of conflating all these things together. The answer to that is like, what would you have the government do? I'd have it not suppress and censor the speech of free people, Americans, because the First Amendment strictly and plainly prohibits that. The government can speak all it wants. It can put out all the information that it wants the people to listen to, but they should be able to listen to anything and believe anything they want. That's really what this comes down to, is that tyrants in government are completely horrified about people having free speech, because they actually want to control what you think. And if you can think for yourself and you can weigh the plausibility of this explanation or that explanation, you can make up your own mind, and you're actually very hard to govern that way. But when you can control literally what people are allowed to say and to hear, that is the definition of tyranny. And for a Supreme Court justice of the United States in America to not really understand that makes you wonder how long we're going to have in America. Because if this is decided, and a lot of conservative lawyers that I read often, Jonathan Turley for one, Scott Johnson over at PowerLine blog, they're very pessimistic about this. They listen to the entire argument and we're like, oh crap, I think the government's going to win this one, and the First Amendment is going to lose. If that happens in a case that is this concrete, this cut and dried by anybody, I'm not an attorney, but this seems very plain to me. If free speech loses this, it is bad news. And we are really going to be going down the road to tyranny, because if you can't say what you want, and if you are silenced by the government for saying things the government doesn't want you to say, the First Amendment is over. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, Jim, you mentioned the Soviet Union Constitution, and they also have a whole bunch of safeguards preventing the government from squashing, they have the First Amendment rights sort of stuff. They have all of these different freedoms of this, that, and the other. But the other quality that the Soviet Union Constitution had that the United States Constitution didn't have was a giant asterisk next to all of those freedoms that said you'll have all of these freedoms as long as it serves the public good. That's a massive asterisk, because if anyone says that some right to housing or right to freedom of speech somehow negatively impacts the public good, then you don't have that freedom anymore. That was one of the biggest flaws of that Soviet Constitution. Intentional flaw, by the way. It was a feature, not a bug, for the ruling class there in the Soviet Union. But that kind of relates to this, right? Because if this is, the First Amendment's great. Everyone loves the First Amendment. This is what they'll say on the left side of the aisle. But if it could potentially lead to public harm, especially during a pandemic, then we can't have that, right? And if you're right, Jim, and this does fall, this court case goes the opposite direction that we're hoping that it goes to, that sets a pretty dangerous precedent, does it not? Because now, it's not that the government can't do this. It's that it can do it as long as that threat to society meets a certain threshold. And is that threshold all the way up here? Or is it over here? Or maybe sometimes it's just down here. I think that it's just... Go ahead.
The threshold is wherever they want it to be.
Exactly.
The emergency in which they must suppress speech can be anything. We know this.
Exactly.
We know this. They make up any excuse they can. We live in a society in which a vast majority of college graduates, it seems, think that your words are actual violence. that you having an opinion that differs from mine makes me unsafe. Do you think that the government is not going to find any justification it wants to suppress your speech? I don't happen to, adhere to this kind of philosophy that the government is my daddy and is there to take care of me. And I really hope the government is protecting me and they have an interest in protecting public health or any sorts of things, but people that go into government tend to think that way. They think, the government has a public duty to protect and to help and all these sort of things. Fine. Even if you think that way, I can mostly get out of the way of that kind of nonsense. But that desire, that interest in the government to protect people stops at the First Amendment. Everything the government does is supposed to stop when it hits the Constitution. For anything it does, any of the amendments, anything in the Constitution, that's the limit of government. You have to go backwards from there. You can't go any farther. And now we live in an America in which they just keep walking right through that barrier that's supposed to protect our rights. And it has to stop. If it doesn't stop here, it's never going to stop. And I'm sorry, Chris, I'm dominating here, but I got
No, it's fine. No. The only thing I was going to mention was the slippery slope argument, which you kind of alluded to already, because if they're saying that this is necessary to do because of a health emergency, well, then why can't they do that because of a climate emergency? And I also do want to say that this has been dealt with before, twice. In the very early years of our republic, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed under the Adams administration, which basically said, because we were in a quasi-war with France, you cannot criticize the government. Guess what happened? They were immediately repealed, and all the people who were put in jail because of that were let go. We then dealt with it under Wilson in World War I, where he tried to make it illegal for you to criticize the government's effort in World War I. Guess what happened? All those were reversed. Okay, so if they're not allowed to doing it during a war, which is literally the biggest emergency you can possibly imagine, how can they possibly say that they can do it based on a health emergency, where we're not all in agreement that it was a real health emergency? Okay. How can they do it in a so-called, quote, climate emergency or whatever emergency that they declare going forward? So I think we really need to make this like abundantly clear. No, government is not allowed to have any say whatsoever over, private speech. End of sentence, period.
Right.
But I'm a little worried too, because if this, if this is allowed to say, well, it's a very special circumstance, and we were trying to protect people's, health in a crazy crisis, then I do think that leads to the slippery slope argument, where then they can say, well, we have also dealing with a gun crisis, so we're going to have to make sure that we monitor how whatever anyone says about guns, so Second Amendment people better watch your mouths going forward. That's the kind of stuff that this results in months, years, decades down the road.
Right. It would almost be you would almost be able to like stomach it if they didn't throw around all these apocalyptic terms all of the time in regards to everything. Chris, you just mentioned the idea of making like guns some sort of like public health emergency. They like literally did that, didn't they? I think like the CDC already did that.
Yeah, yeah. Joe Biden created an entire new White House office of gun prevention.
How often?
Well,
how often?
No,
go ahead.
No,
finish
sorry.
It. No, finish.
No, I was just going to say that I don't know that there's anywhere in the Constitution where it says that the president can create a gun control office. Like, what is this?
I don't know, but like the sounding the alarms on climate change happens basically every couple of weeks. Just the last thing that we talked about with Trump and the bloodbath comments. I mean, they're talking about it like it's the second coming of Hitler. Is that not an extreme enough scenario where we need to protect public health and make sure that those messages don't go out on social media? I mean, I just feel like this logic could be applied to any number of things that they would want to censor online. So to give them a camel's nose underneath the tent on this issue, that's not going to end well. That's not going to end well at all.
Yeah, I mean, I can envision a day in which you are not allowed to criticize EVs and you are not allowed to promote gasoline-powered cars because that's terrible for the environment, and therefore you are an eco-terrorist or whatever that they, come up with. I really, really don't want to live in that kind of a society. And what's so crazy to me, and I think I can speak for both of you, is that when I was growing up, this was not even like imagined. This, so I mean, I think that September 11th obviously had some to do with this, with all the, all the national security state and all the, surveillance stuff. But, it's just getting worse and worse with every so-called crisis that, that comes. The government just gets more powerful, and the people are, for the most part, are willing to cede that power.
Right. Jim, we're about at the hour mark. Final comments on this story before we wrap it up.
Yeah, I mean, I say this to you a lot, Donnie, and it just keeps coming up. I keep waiting. It's very troubling to me that there is nobody in the room in these government agencies or anywhere who sees these blatant and obvious and egregious violations of the rights of their fellow Americans, and nobody in the room says, "Hey, guys, should we be doing this? This seems a little. This seems like it might violate the First Amendment." I mean, just taking it from the government standpoint, and apparently, there's nobody in the Supreme Court who would have a chat with Ketanji Brown Jackson and say, "Hey, the First Amendment is supposed to hamstring the government." There's apparently nobody is there.
Point. That's the whole point.
Is around to say that. And then just to tie it back to how we started this podcast, you remember how the media absolutely lost their minds, as they did every day. And when Trump called CNN "your fake news," that was a almost country-ending attack on the First Amendment, because he went after the press by calling them fake news. Now, and here is an actual attack on the First Amendment, and it's gone all the way to the Supreme Court. And the coverage of this is where it exists. Chris, you'd have to tell me. Maybe they're talking about this on CNN and MSNBC, and maybe they're not. But I doubt very much that the coverage of this is anywhere like the way we're coming at it from, where this is an egregious violation of the rights of every American to speak their mind. So Trump just makes fun of the press, and that's a threat to democracy. It's destruction of the First Amendment. But then this actual destruction of the First Amendment, it's fine. It just tells you where the media is today. It is in service of an increasingly tyrannical regime. And if this continues like this, I hope I live long enough to see it turn around, but we'll be going down a pretty dark road.
Pretty wild stuff. All right, go ahead, Chris. Final word.
Literally one very quick comment. Jim was, asking if MSNBC actually has stories of this nature. No, they don't. You know why? Because MSNBC does not actually get into policy. It's all politics.
Right.
And that is a very big difference also between Fox and MSNBC and CNN. MSNBC and CNN, they politicize and spin everything. They never get into substantive debates about the First Amendment or climate change or anything like that. It's always politics 24/7. And I think that, that's just how they view everything. They view everything through a political lens, not through a truth lens or a policy lens or the way that we do, a constitutional lens or whatever it is.
Yeah, Jim, how are they going to spend time talking about, Supreme Court cases and other stuff that could impact, the country as a whole, when they're talking about January 6, 2021? I mean, that's clearly is the most important thing going on. Another important thing going on is a couple of different environment stories. Didn't have time to get into it today, but the UN is once again sounding a red alert when it comes to climate. Joe Biden is imposing stronger than ever climate change rules for cars. So that whole climate change, everything that has to do with it that we were kind of just talking about in regards to the First Amendment, they're pushing that very strong. Seems like they're pushing it stronger than ever lately, which is makes it more important than ever that we have certain people fighting back against the climate alarm narrative. One of those groups just put out a movie called Climate the Movie that is going to be the feature topic of Heartland's premiere show on climate issues, which is the Climate Realism Show, which is on Heartland's main channel on YouTube at noon Central Time. They're going to be talking about that with one of the people behind, in the production of the movie. So they're going to have a great interview on that. So if you want to hear about that and more content from the Heartland Institute, make sure to tune in Fridays at noon Central Time to our main Heartland Institute channel on YouTube. Gentlemen, any last words you want to get off your chest before we sign off for the day?
Nope.
Hearing nothing, I will thank all of you for tuning in to this episode of the In the Tank podcast. Join us every week for a new episode. If you're listening to the audio version, first off, leave a review for us on iTunes. That'd be greatly appreciated. But you're probably catching this on a Friday or later. You can join us a day earlier on Thursdays at noon Central Time, where we are live streaming on Facebook and YouTube and X and Rumble. And you can join the conversation, throw your comments and questions in the chat. Maybe we'll show your comment in the screen. Maybe we'll address your questions on the fly. Also, super chat functionality is enabled if you want to support the show that way. Or you can just hit that like button, share this content, subscribe, leave a comment under the video. All those things help break through those big tech algorithms that prevent content like this from being shown to more people. Also, you can follow us on X at In The Tank Pod, or send us your comments, suggestions, or questions to the show by emailing us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Jim Lakely, where can the fine people find you?
At Heartland Inst on X, at JLakely on X, and always visit heartland.org.
Fantastic. And Chris Talgo, what do you have to pitch today?
What I'm going to pitch is tonight, we are having a big debate here at the Heartland Institute headquarters about the future of America, and everyone should come and participate.
Nice. Very nice.
And
All right.
and we're going to have great food.
That's the most important thing. All right. Thank you all for tuning into this episode. We will talk to you next week.
He's a lion, dog-faced pony soldier.